Um, Thank you for coming in today and talking to us a little bit about your own poetry and ecopoetics and process-based poetry. Um, as I understand ecopoetics, ecopoetics seems to create a space for drawing connections between human activity and the environment that shapes it, and perhaps as we progress into unprecedented states of environmental degradation, the human impact on the environment. Um, while we don't experience the full historical trajectory of poets writing about or on nature in this class, we can safely say that poets have been writing about nature for quite some time. I'm curious, though, how ecopoetics engages with or differs from these traditions of writing about nature, and how old or recent you think this particular poesis is. What some of the coordinates for ecopoetry or ecopoetics are for you.
Great. Well, I do think it's, in some respects, nature poetry is the oldest tradition we have. You can go back to Hesiod's works and days, and he's writing about nature. He's writing about survival as agronomy. So thinking about that, or thinking about the pastoral tradition, we go back to Theocritus and Virgil, etc. So that is very much, I think, a deep well to draw from. Ecopoetics, though, I think draws some distinctions from that long tradition, really, in its conversation with Romanticism, and trying to draw a distinction between nature poetry and ecopoetry. Perhaps the largest distinction being the taking down of nature as a sort of symbolic signifier, and collapsing the distance between poet and nature, so that, say in the case of Wordsworth, this idea of nature is something to go be inspired by. You're out in the field, you have this wonderful experience, and then you go home to your nice little cottage and you have your spontaneous emotions recollected in tranquility. And that distance from the subject, or the distantiation that nature does as a kind of construction, keeps people away from, or removes them from the field. So ecopoetics really tries to reinscribe the human in situ, in the field, and not separate from or a higher being than the nature itself, so that the human and nature is really intermingled, and looking at, as you say, the impact of human interaction with the nature, but all those other forces too, so that the human is simply one force in a field of agents. And I think that sort of humility about that shows up by, let's say, eliminating the impulse towards personification, or trying to make nature a symbol in general, and trying to make it a here and now property that's in flux, is susceptible to all the same vicissitudes as everything else. And I think that's parallel really to that recognition of the human impact on the environment that's been really going. You ask about sort of origins. I think in a lot of ways, a lot of the origins sort of emerge out of the emerging environmental movement in the 60s, ethnopoetics, Jerome Rothenberg's world anthologies, Shaking the Pumpkin, forgetting the other one now, but his Symposium, The Whole, trying to bring in all of these different cultures. And as soon as we do that, that comparative look reveals radically different kind of treatments of nature. And so then we have, and then parallel kind of political movements like Earth Day or the Whole Earth Catalog, and those moves begin to sort of collapse that distance, that nature is always elsewhere and it's right here, and what are we doing to this? And even to some of the earliest Earth Days, I think, actually happened on this campus. And so those movements, I think, begin to destabilize these sort of conceptions of nature, and bring in other kinds of points of view.
Yeah, that's really helpful and interesting. And thinking about just the couple of poems that students have read of yours for in preparation for this interview, um, that there seems to be a real ethical strain in ecopoetics that is not necessarily as present or not in the same way with earlier romantics. I'm curious about how you see this working in this kind of attention that's a different kind of attention, and how you see that working in, for example, a river in the spring and the kind of observation that sort of drives the movement of that poem. Like what are the ethical concerns that drive that, or what is the kind of attention that that allows for that poem to occur?
I think the ethical concerns are to try always to be a part of, and I think that's one of the tensions that ecopoetics articulates, is this apart from, a part of distinction, and how language in one way could be this sort of distinguishing element that makes human endeavors somehow different, but to try to then turn that impulse back towards the site where that language arises. So in A River in Spring, it's trying to pay attention to the river as a system that articulates the syntax of water, or the syntax of a riparian system, and tries to look at human interactions in that environment as simply part of this larger use for, and to try to use the language of the river, or use the language of that site as a kind of grounding figure. And I think once one does that, then the very complex and perhaps even competing uses, let's say, of the river become apparent, and the ethical kind of ground by which one says this is a good practice or that's a good practice begins to show itself. And we see that then our commitment might be for recreation and not for the sustainability of the river in geologic time. And so hopefully that poem kind of captures some of those dilemmas that really, like, looking at nature does. Like, as we go to nature for solace, or for solitude, or to be inspired, or to see beauty again. But if we aestheticize those things, we push them away. And so the ethical impulse of ecopoetics is to collapse that distance and not make nature this, elsewhere figure, but it's right here, and that the trash alongside the river is equally part of that natural system. And how can we more subtly kind of interact with that, or recognize that, or in fact use the language of all the things that are there, to sort of offer a more realistic, I guess, portrait of what that place is.
Yeah, I like the way that we move through those different concerns of observing but allowing for those competing uses of nature to come in the poem. The lines, what is a river, and what is a season, and what is a season of, and what is a reason of oil, a season of oil, like that there's not a way to, there's not a walling off of that violence. It has to enter the poem as well, but the way that the observation leads to a recognition of that, I think is really valuable.
And specifically there, thinking of, that poem, for a long time, a lot of my poems emerge out of a kind of occasional practice. And so part of what I wanted to do there was to acknowledge that this was a river in spring. It's very literal in thinking of it as a cycle. And then within that sort of matrix of a season, how does that manifest as the natural stuff that's growing there, or the increased flow of the river? But then also a season for the river could be experienced as the death of the river in its use for fracking or for future agriculture that embodies this sense of use in a much more both devastating sense and a long-term sense. And so trying to like play with that idea of a seasonal attention that reveals, oh, look at how beautiful the river is right now, and everyone's out and it's beautiful out here, we're walking along the river, and then, well, what is the real season of this river? In our case, the Kashilaputa River, the season of it might be ending if we dam the river in the inevitable 10 years when this, or 25 years that this NIST project has been kind of going on. So there's a kind of folded irony to that might be, well, the season is, I was there when it was a free-flowing river, and now it's not. And so if the poem marks some kind of occasion with that, it has something to do with kind of wanting to both acknowledge the sort of immediate impact of that as a kind of sensory experience, but then also thinking of, well, our senses of rivers are uses for them, not simply aesthetic enjoyment. So something of that complexity is tried to be sort of folded into it.
Yeah, that attention to a particular moment or season, that feels really important to your poetry for me. And I don't know, I think of moments just at the beginning of Spool 25, I am beginning to see and continuing to see, like, that commenting on that seems really essential to the work of the poems. Mm-hmm. And attention to the world around us, natural and otherwise. One thing that you encourage in students' poetry, which I've found extremely productive, is an exploration of various attention and process-based poetics, a walk poem, for example. Mm-hmm.